The 7th chapter. It was all the madness God could imagine, set free to grow and twist under its own accord. Nothing was its purpose, and yet from this was how everything came to be. From this world, it would seem that if fate did exist, it was written at the atomic level. Message inscribed on the Yolopal's main reactor. Deicide woke from the burning sensation in his nose. The membrane filter in his nostrils had liquefied and dripped onto his lips. It meant that his umbilical connection had been severed, and he would have to breathe normally. He confirmed it with the hard look at his umbilicals. They acted as pipes directly to his life support system. Without the link through folded space, Deicide was cut off from necessities beyond food, air, and water, but also a murky brown solution known as halcyonic cider. This liquid calmed the bestial properties of an eater's power. Without this chemical, Deicide and his troops were less than savage dogs. Though cannibalistic and efficient, the Deathless had remained undefeated. But after seeing Deicide devour the heart of a conquered tribe leader, Knot began to develop a chemical substitute that would allow them to channel their predatory focus. This led to the discovery of kill boxes soon after, a technique Deicide considered invaluable. But with he and the Abyss running dry of their nutrients, it would not be long before they were experiencing the dark cravings. Deicide reached for a small pouch clipped to his belt behind him. He punctured the seal with a sharp index finger and retrieved the emergency supplies. After he had allowed the last of the pure vestige to drain on the ground, he began to apply an epoxy resin to seal his damaged umbilicals. He sat holding them, waiting for the substance to harden. With little vestige in them, the umbilicals were dead weight and lay impotently on the deck. Then he checked to make sure his locator beacon was working properly, but found that it was already dead. He wanted to be angry at whoever had gun-decked this bit of maintenance, but this piece of equipment was new, and nothing faulty was even allowed to leave the factories operating for Yolopal use. Each item was tirelessly machine-tested, though he could not be so sure of manufacturing for the districts. From the folds in his tattered uniform top, the Abyss stared up at him, the size of a softball. Even after consuming the drained vestige, she was completely harmless. The impenetrable shell of security provided by the Abyss and the Deathless had been torn away. Deicide's newfound vulnerability forced a tremble through his spine, and suddenly the surrounding air was much colder than before. With each movement, he could feel his muscles burning the energy he needed to live. While connected to the Yolopal, he was immortal, but once out of pocket, Deicide and the Abyss were fuel-glutton vehicles with considerable-sized holes in their tanks. He wondered when the rebels would arrive to place him in shackles, but none came. No one came, to his surprise. Surely the torturing of the cyborgs that threw him down that tunnel had carried on quickly enough. Where was White? Hellmouth? Where were the people that loved him? He shouted hello a few times and rocked on his backside a few moments, before speaking words that all his surrogate mothers and fathers had beaten out of him as a child. "Help!" Deicide said, knowing he would sound twice as pathetic in his enemy's ears and triple in Hellmouth's. After shouting a few more times, he was overcome with impatience and shame, hoping no one had heard at all. He was one of the few that had made it, the only male no less. They had expected him to die with the others, but she did not. They had made a deal, Deicide thought as he glanced down at the Abyss. Her yellow eyes had now consumed most of her total mass. This new silence was strange to him. Not only did he hear nothing around him, but his mind was quiet as well. And there was but a single mind. Only the brain inside his skull was accessible to him. The amanuensis' constant updating, now gone. He had even lost the old message traffic from this morning. Knot was gone too then. If he was severed from the amanuensis, then surely he had lost connection with her. Any previous silence between him and his wife had been done voluntarily by one of them. How he wished now that he possessed Knot's wretched telepathy channel, if only to tell her not to worry, that he was alive and would kill whoever dared to separate the two of them, no matter how brief. Deicide had enough and started his legs moving, dragging his dead umbilicals behind him. He trudged along a winding tunnel littered with exhausted and broken weapons of all types, from Gauss rifles to crude spears. Long extinguished flames had scorched the walls, warping the polished arcs above, like the pregnant underbelly of some street dog. The roads were pocked with gaping craters. Around their perimeter were corpses whose insides were completely exposed to the open air. Nothing about this disgusting scene bothered Deicide, except for the fact that it had not been cleaned up yet. Unless they were stacked in piles in the processing factory, he detested seeing bodies strewn about in his districts. From his surroundings, Deicide could see that the rebel forces had not folded easily, but there was no enemy that could match his deathless array. As he moved on, he noticed that the walls were abnormally decayed. He could not have fallen far from Altura, yet this place looked more in common with the fringes, which resided at the very end of the city platters, the very back of the ship's entirety. He wondered how any district could be this far gone without alerting the automated systems monitoring the city's figures. Time had battered this sector more than any battle could. Enormous gashes split through the walls from rust. Verdigris caked over every copper surface. He caught the sight of a calibration tag for a pressure gauge and was puzzled by the inscription. His wife was very stringent about small details, and he was instantly perturbed by the serial numbers being stamped where the date should have been. This check was done by a machine. It lacked the ability to make mistakes. Even if one were to manipulate the calibration tag under the machine's stamp, it would wait indefinitely until the right place appeared. The tunnel opened to a deranged assembly of structures, with Deicide instantly recognizing the Yolopau's internal architecture, crammed into the street before. He climbed over several twisted roadblocks and into his once noble vessel. The glossy sheen of the walls had been worn away. He rubbed his sharp fingers along a plaque that had a mirror finish just this morning. Calling out only returned the sound of his own voice to his ears, which came back increasingly apprehensive and forlorn. It pained him to look at the destruction surrounding him. He wondered what universal force was so grand that even the Yolopau could not curb its sway. He wondered if his rival, the Nazareth, had grown so embittered by their impotence in combat that they had sent themselves on a suicide mission. This amount of damage would have to be cosmic in scale. For Deicide to be able to cross into his ship from a district as far down the platter queue as Altura, it would have to be nearly tied into a knot. Further, he journeyed through the wreckage of his ship, its halls only lit by emergency lighting, and a blue glowing mold he found more of as he came closer to the executive offices. As he crossed the long deactivated moving walkways, he looked over the side through the cracked, transparent floors that ran above and beneath him. An immense growth of vegetation was present, encompassing nearly every surface in varying abundance. Thousands of species of plant life spiraled down into the shaft of shattered floors. Flora he knew should be extinct had completely taken over this portion of the ship. Roots of some great tree had torn their way throughout the immense multi-level gallery, warping the enormous layered bulkheads, twisting thousands of miles of hallways and catwalks into some galactic-scale needlework. It amazed him that this place could become so convoluted and yet maintain an atmosphere. Surely there must be a leak somewhere, but here he was, breathing moist, sweet air provided by this strange habitat. He pressed onward into the office complex, strangely left somewhat intact by the legion of creepers and shrubbery. Desperately he searched for a functioning terminal. Most were shattered, strangled by vegetation, and those that were, able to be powered by the emergency hand cranks, were displayed in some garbled machine language. He failed to understand why his wife refused to use one program language for all. As he began to move his fingers across the faint holographic keyboard, flickering from the terminal, he felt something that had been always a novelty for him living inside a ship, a cool breeze. Perhaps the district's wind simulation machine was still active. As the gust brushed past his antennas, immediately shot up and snapped in all directions. He wrangled a few minutes more with the half-remembered code, clumsily forcing what he knew into the command line. But just when he had given up, his eyes laid upon the date and time of his access. If it was to be believed, he was trillions of years in the future. His knees buckled, but he caught himself on the workstation supports. He turned around and began to view the greenery, as if he had seen it for the first time. He walked over to touch the gnarled roots and plucked the alien flowers to make sure they were real. The abyss crawled out to sample juicy fruits hanging from the vines that were braided around towering columns. Hours later, Deicide was still seated against a balcony overlooking the flora-saturated plaza. He looked down at the abyss, who seemed to be his only companion left in this existence, and squeezed her to his chest. Even without her ghastly powers, she would have been useful to him. He remembered the first time he had gazed upon her true face, her actual form, a snarling war princess, her tribe torn apart from a battle within the family. He had taught her about the pleasantries of life, and she had shown him the realities of a true war, nothing concerning numbers or ethics. For when a true war ended, the figures were too hard to calculate, and no one left behind to judge.